everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8. In this brief video, we're going to discuss treatments for depressive and bipolar disorders. Please note that for your exam, I've only pulled, I think, 2 questions from this chapter, because it's a little shorter than the rest. I wanted us to, really understand the different symptoms that are associated with the disorders we saw in chapters 5, 6, and 7. So that's going to be a heavy focus of this exam. Whereas, while treatment is definitely important, it's a little more straightforward in this chapter. So let's begin with this brief video. So, what we're going to look at today are treatments for unipolar depression and treatments for bipolar depression or bipolar disorders. So make sure you know the difference between those two. We're going to look at psychological approaches, sociocultural approaches, biological approaches, and also adjunctive psychotherapy for bipolar disorders. So, for treatments with unipolar depression, that's what we're going to focus on first, these psychological approaches. We're looking at how we can give people the tools to work through their cognition. So work through those thoughts that can lead to maladaptive attitudes. In psychodynamic therapy, I want you to think about what the psychodynamic perspective believes underlies depression. It's usually that sense of loss that they emphasize in both Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. So psychodynamic therapy is going to take the approach of helping the client bring about those issues of loss or grief, whether real or imagined. I'm going to say imagined, but don't take it with that negative connotation it usually has, and bring it to consciousness and help them work through that trauma. This is usually more effective with modest or moderate depression. For cases of severe depression, it's not exactly beneficial, and the evidence is still kind of fuzzy because, again, psychodynamic approaches are very hard to research. Cognitive behavioral therapy, a strong focus on this type of therapy as always, is looking at how we can change someone's thought patterns and their behaviors, and how those thought patterns affect behaviors, and how behaviors affect thought patterns. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at: behavioral activation, Beck's cognitive therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. These are the big ones. Behavioral activation is this idea that if we can get people moving, we can get them engaged in behaviors, it'll help them with having a sense of pleasure. It's kind of the idea when people go, like, exercising. Exercise has been shown to help with depressive symptoms, right? Because you're getting your body moving, you're getting neurotransmitters going, the kind of feel-good neurotransmitters, right? Those norepinephrine and serotonin. Even maybe adrenaline helps us out a little bit, or, endorphins. So we're trying to increase the number of pleasurable activities and events in the client's life. So maybe giving them a schedule, and there was a nice kind of summary on page 224, I think, of your text, that kind of give a brief example of a schedule that a therapist would diagnose for their client. And it's even marking things that we would see as mundane, like going to the grocery store. But still, having that available to them is very important. The schedule is on page 226. The components I wanted you to look at were on page 224. Very self-explanatory, so I'll save that for you all to research. I don't want to give away too much in this lecture. But, very important, the main focus is that focus on behavior. I would know those key components, though. Beck's cognitive therapy. Remember Aaron Beck, he talked about the cognitive triad and maladaptive thoughts and automatic thoughts, and how those all lend themselves to a certain type of cognitive, I don't want to say decline, but we kind of get stuck in the same thought patterns, and they tend to be quite negative or kind of breed hopelessness. So Beck's cognitive therapy is trying to confront those maladaptive thoughts. So recognizing and changing those negative cognitive processes. So sometimes this will entail the client participating in homework. So anytime they have maybe a maladaptive thought pattern they recognize, they would write it down, and what kind of thoughts are going through their mind, and bring it to the therapist again at their next session to talk about it. So it has different phases. Phase 1 is increasing activities and elevating moods, so using that behavioral activation. 2, challenging those automatic thoughts. So kind of asking like, if someone has an automatic thought like, I am just horrible and I can't do anything right? Someone may automatically think that in response to a task they tried to complete but didn't necessarily do to their liking. The therapist will try to challenge that thought, maybe ask them questions about it, gather more information, so that the next phase, phase 3, the client can identify negative thinking and biases, because that's important that they're able to identify them on their own. So phase 2 is kind of like the therapist helping, whereas phase 3 is the client being able to identify those things themselves. Then we have changing primary attitudes. So this comes with the confrontation aspect. So now that the client is able to recognize those negative thoughts and biases and challenge the thoughts that are coming, we're giving them the skills they need to change their attitudes, right? Because your attitudes are like your feelings. That's different than your thoughts, just so you know. And the next kind of CBT we're going to talk about is acceptance and commitment therapy. This is always kind of presented, what's the word I'm looking for? Alongside Beck's cognitive therapy, because one of the components of Beck's therapy is that you have to confront the negative thoughts, whereas acceptance and commitment therapy says you need to accept that these thoughts are a natural part of thinking, accept them as a function of the mind, and let them go. Right, so it's a very different approach. We're not confronting the thoughts in acceptance and commitment therapy. We're accepting them as things that happen within our brain and letting them go. So kind of understand the difference between those two, how they're similar and how they're kind of juxtaposed. That's the word I was looking for. For multicultural treatments, this is very important for all different types of therapy, and our text makes a point to bring it up for depression specifically because it is a culture-sensitive therapy. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at issues of specific, our book uses the term minority groups. I know sometimes we don't use that word. We use like people of color instead of like minority groups. But whichever term you use for people of color, minority groups, we're looking at the differences in cultural values, culture-related stressors, prejudices, and stereotypes. Because those prejudices and stereotypes that people face, perceived or not, are going to affect their views of depression. So for example, I believe it's Native Americans have much higher rates of depression and suicide, significantly more than all other people of color. Okay, and so in understanding if you're treating or working with a client who is of Native American ancestry, it's important that you have cultural sensitive training so that you understand their cultural values. You know, different cultures are going to have different rules for how they emote or express emotions. They're going to have different cultural norms and stressors. You know, me as a white woman, I couldn't just go in and try to give therapy to someone of a different culture assuming that their experience is similar to mine. I would have to take the time to be trained and to understand that what they're facing, how it affects how they're thinking, how it affects their behaviors, their emotions, right? Because that takes a lot of empathy because I don't experience that firsthand. And I've included a video on the next slide. It's called Multicultural Counseling, and it gives a really great informational session on why it's important and what kind of methods they use to train people to be multiculturally competent. So check that out on the next slide. Very interesting. In fact, I'll give you 2 extra credit points because I feel like not everyone watches these videos. I'll give you 2 extra credit points if you email me with a brief summary of that video. And your brief summary of the video and anything you found interesting about it. One thing. 2 extra credit points. So, then family social treatments. You have interpersonal psychotherapy. So that's really important for people with depression because that interpersonal support, having that support system around you is very important to help facilitate that person's needs. I saw a meme the other day. Someone said, I pay to go to therapy because there are people around me who won't. or something like that. Because a lot of times when people go to therapy, especially if they have a muddy family situation where it's kind of toxic, you're taking that one person out of therapy so that they can get healing. What happens at the end of therapy? They go back into that crappy scenario, right? Go back to that toxicity, and they're trying to learn how to deal with it, but it doesn't help if you don't have support. So that's what we're looking with family social treatments. How can we make it so that person comes out of therapy, they go to their therapy, and the family has the tools to support them and integrate that information and practice it at home? So we got different interpersonal problem areas that could possibly lead to depression. We're looking at interpersonal loss, very psychodynamic almost. Interpersonal role dispute, so looking at our different roles and how they combat with, roles others have for us or what have you. Interpersonal role transition, so a change of role. Sometimes things that could cause depression is, maybe someone goes through a divorce and they're now a single dad. Who has full custody of their children, and they were previously used to being in a partnership. That is a role transition that someone has to get used to. And interpersonal deficits, so things that the person has noticed they're deficient in, skills they are lacking. Maybe these are real or imagined, but they can affect their levels of depression. And that kind of leads to the next area we're going with, couple therapy, because this is going to be the most helpful for people who have depression that's a result of marital discord. So like, a lot of arguing within the marriage. So maybe they don't have these depressive thoughts so much outside of that relationship, right? It's not always the case where people want to, quit the relationship. So they'll participate in couple therapy. Sometimes divorce is necessary, right? For some people, but sometimes people want to work out their differences and to facilitate that communication, which is very important. So in couple therapy, we're looking at how we can give people communication skills, help them recognize problematic interactions they're having. So maybe recognizing when their emotions are over the top, or maybe when they're misunderstanding each other in arguments. I use this with my husband because we're not perfect, we fight too. But sometimes what helps is repeating what the other person said to clarify what they said. So if you hear one thing and it sounds pretty nasty, just say, hey, what did you mean by that? Or can you explain that more, right? Recognizing problematic interactions, when people jump to conclusions, trying to translate what is being said and understood. Communication is very important. And helping them accept, the things that don't matter, like fighting over taking out the garbage, right? And supporting one another. So complementing the roles within the household, for example. It sounds silly, but even making like a chore chart, right? Clearly delineated tasks can help for people to provide support for one another. Very important in couple therapy. Here's the video I have in question. So if you play it in the full screen mode, it will open for you. Remember, you have to do... Sorry, I'm going to back up from this. So when you click into it, you're going to do slideshow up at the top, then from current slide. That's the way you're going to view the video. And then you're able to play it. Excuse me. So, treatments for unipolar depression. I'm going to end this first video on biological approaches. Antidepressant drugs and brain stimulation. These are the two overarching things we're going to look at. Antidepressant drugs do not work for everyone. I know there are commercials everywhere out, talking about antidepressants. They are a great resource, but I don't want us to think that they help everyone. I think it's like 40% of people who take antidepressant drugs they don't work for them. So it really depends on you, what drug works best for you. If you decide to take an antidepressant or a client decides to take an antidepressant, it really depends on a lot of different factors. But there are different kinds. Really quickly, an MAOI, monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Tricyclics and second-generation antidepressants. SSRIs are very popular now. These are supposed to increase your serotonin activity exclusively, whereas MAOIs are trying to block what's called monoamine oxidase. And the point of monoamine oxidase is to break down serotonin and norepinephrine, or things that are left in that synaptic gap. Well, so what should we do? We should block that monoamine oxidase from doing that because we want the serotonin in there. We want the norepinephrine to work better. So that's the function of MAOIs, to block monoamine oxidase. That's like a tongue twister. Tricyclics are kind of similar in that we're trying to help facilitate, you know, those neurotransmitters and how they work, but it's blocking overly vigorous neurotransmitter reuptake. Remember how we talked about in Psych 150, the neurotransmitters jump the synaptic gap and whatever's kind of left over gets reuptake back into the sending neuron, or axon, excuse me. Well, tricyclics try to slow down that process so it doesn't reuptake too much too soon, to let the synapse have time to soak up those neurotransmitters. Soak up isn't the right word, but you get what I'm saying. Then we have brain stimulation. So this is using electricity in your brain, basically, and it's usually used for severe cases of depression. So they're not just going to shock you randomly and be like, okay, go ahead, right? It's using very targeted approaches. It was discovered accidentally because, this is so, like, interesting to me, because the researchers who discovered it were like, hey, I noticed that people with epilepsy don't tend to have depression. Maybe it's because they have seizures. And so what could we do to cause seizures? Let's electrocute people. It sounds really dark, but read it in your text. Very interesting. Wasn't always used the best way, obviously, but now it's reformed. It's a refined method, and it's still only used in more severe cases of depression that are not responsive to other means. So not responsive to antidepressants, not responsive to psychotherapy. And so in this treatment, basically electrodes are attached to your head. There are different types. Sometimes they do the electrodes on either side of your head, and sometimes they stimulate one side of your head, so they'll put the two electrodes on one side so that the electric shock goes through. Now, this can result in a lot of, like, it used to result in, like, broken bones and stuff because people would be having a seizure and their bodies would be shaking. But not so much anymore. They're trying to control those effects, so sometimes people will be sedated so their bodies don't jerk around and stuff. And then there's also vagus nerve stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and deep brain stimulation. So make sure you kind of know the difference on those. Okay? Transcranial magnetic stimulation is kind of the same as ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, but we're trying to stimulate the brain without the negative effects, so without the jolting, without the broken bones that we've seen. And I think the effects are minor in comparison.